The highlands of Montana in the winter of 1883 were no place for a man with a hollowed-out heart. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed against the glass and slipped under the door sills. For Caleb Wright, it was a penance. He met it head-on, rising before the sun clawed its way over the eastern ridge, his breath plumbing in the dark of his small cabin. He'd pull on his boots, his fingers stiff, and step out into the white. His days were a rhythm of survival, sharp and clear. He spent them in the snowy wilderness that bordered the small, wind-lashed town of Belridge. He tended his cattle, hardy beasts that pawed through the crust of snow for the cured grass beneath, their coats thick with frost. He cut firewood, the rhythmic crack of his axe the only sound for miles, the vibrations jarring up his arms, the scent of pine resin, sharp and clean, was better than the smell of town, which was always coal smoke and judgment. Caleb was a man carved from the land he worked, scarred and solitary. He was respected in Belridge. The ranchers knew his skill. The man could read a blizzard like a broadsheet and knew cattle better than most men knew their own children. But respect was laced with pity, and pity was a thing Caleb could not abide. He saw it in the eyes of Mrs. Soper at the mercantile when he made his supply runs, the way she'd pressed an extra apple into his sack. He heard it in the silence that fell when he entered the saloon for a whiskey, a silence that only broke when he left. He avoided town. He avoided the closeness of other people. Most of all, he avoided Christmas. This was the season of the haunting. The memories didn't drift in gently. They struck, sharp and sudden as the lightning that had started it all. 2 Christmases ago. Not 2 years, 2 Christmases. The calendar had split his life, before and after. Before was Sarah, her laughter like warm honey, her hands always busy, kneading dough or stitching a quilt. Before was little Alara, 5 years old, a whirlwind of dark curls and bright, mismatched stockings, convinced she could teach the barn cats to sing carols. After that was the smell of smoke and wet ash, a freak winter storm. A bolt of lightning had found the one tall pine near the old cabin, splitting it and sending a cascade of fire onto the dry shingle roof. He had been miles away, clearing a fallen tree from the pass. By the time he saw the glow, he was too late. He had run until his lungs felt like they were full of hot coals, but all he could do was stand in the snow and watch his world burn down, the heat blistering his face while the cold froze his soul. He lived in the old line cabin now, a smaller, meaner structure higher up the slope. He had not lit the hearth in his main cabin, the one he'd built for her, since the fire. He just couldn't. Now, with the holiday approaching, the ghosts walked closer. He saw Sarah in the shape of the snowdrift against the barn. He heard Alara's shriek of delight in the cry of a blue jay. He worked harder, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed and his hands were raw. Anything to be too tired to dream. One evening, riding the perimeter of his land, he found himself on the ridge overlooking the town. The sun was a bloody smear in the west, and the windows of Belridge were beginning to glow yellow. Down in the valley, at the Johansson place, he saw them, the whole family. He could see them through the large parlor window, lit by the bright glow of a dozen candles. They were decorating a tree. Her father was holding up little Anna Johansson, barely Alara's age, to place a paper star on the highest branch. Caleb pulled his horse, a big roan gelding, to a stop. The wind whipped his hair, stinging his eyes until they watered, or perhaps it was not the wind. He watched them for a long time, a fist tightening in his chest. The warmth, the light, the belonging. It was a language he no longer spoke. He turned his horse away, the creak of the saddle leather loud in the sudden dusk. He didn't know who he was talking to, the horse, the empty land, or the God he'd cursed 2 years prior. A quiet wish, ragged and broken, escaped his throat, barely a whisper against the moan of the wind. "All I want for Christmas," he muttered, his voice raw, "is her." He had no face in his mind, no name. It was not a wish for Sarah, for she was gone. It was a wish for the absence to be filled, a longing for something, anything, to stop the endless aching cold. Miles away, that same wind was trying to murder Mira Thorne. She was riding through a blizzard in the high pass, pushing toward Belridge, a name she'd only seen on a dog-eared map. The snow was not the gentle powder of Caleb's valley. It was a horizontal assault of ice and grit. Her horse, a tough little Mustang she called Viento, stumbled, his head low. "Just a little more, boy," she whispered, her words stolen by the gale. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She couldn't feel her feet. Mira was running. She was always running. Her last stop had been a missionary school 200 miles east, a place that promised salvation and delivered hypocrisy. Her former employer, the Reverend Blackwood, had a wife like a dried corn husk and hands that wandered. Mira, with her dark hair that fell in waves instead of a tight bun, and her skin that held the faint gold of her mother's Mexican blood, was a temptation. When his hand had found her waist in the pantry, she had cracked his wrist with a rolling pin. 2 nights later, the schoolhouse burned. They never found proof of who started it, but the whispers were immediate and vicious. The Reverend, his wrist in a splint, had publicly prayed for her sullied soul, blaming her for tempting him, for bringing wickedness, for the fire itself. The women of the town, led by Blackwood's wife, had shamed her, calling her a harlot, a half-breed witch. She had left before they could find a rope. Her whole life had been a series of towns like that. Her dark hair, her high cheekbones, her foreign blood, a product of a mother she barely remembered and a white father she'd never known, made her a target. She was too bold for the women and too other for the men who looked at her with either lust or suspicion, and often both. Her only defense, her only anchor, was a leather-bound journal tucked inside her coat. It was filled with the fading ink of her mother's hand, poetry, herbal remedies, and maps of places she'd never seen. Her mother, a woman who had fought for her own place in the world, had taught Mira to read, to write, and to endure. "No dejes que te rompan," her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't let them break you." She was close to breaking now, cold, broken, and bitter from the betrayal. She rode into Belridge under the cover of the worsening storm. The town was shuttered, the streets empty. She saw the livery stable, its large doors a promise of shelter. She didn't have the 2 bits for a stall, but she couldn't leave Viento in the storm. She slid off the horse, her legs collapsing beneath her. She was starving, having eaten her last biscuit 2 days ago. She clung to the horse's mane, pulling herself toward the door, her vision blurring. She managed to push the small side door open and stumbled into the relative warmth, the smell of hay and manure filling her lungs. She collapsed onto a pile of feed sacks. The journal clutched to her chest. Her last thought was an apology to her horse. Caleb Wright was in the livery, trading a repaired saddle for a new set of tools with the owner, a man named Hames. They were in the back office, sharing a cup of bitter coffee. When the door creaked open, "Damn wind," Hames muttered, getting up. "Thought I barred that." He opened the office door and stopped. "Well, hell." Caleb looked past him. At first, he thought it was a pile of rags. Then he saw the dark hair, fanned out over the rough burlap. It was a woman. Hames, a decent man but not a brave one, looked wary. "Is she drunk?" Caleb was already moving. He knelt beside her. She was small, soaked through and shivering violently. Her face was pale as porcelain, lips an alarming shade of blue. She was half frozen. "She's near dead," Caleb said. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet wool and cold bones. He didn't wait for Hames. He kicked the main door open and carried her out into the storm, heading straight for Doc Irwin's cabin 2 streets over. He didn't register the strangeness of the act. He didn't think about the fact that he hadn't touched another person outside of a handshake. In 2 years, he just moved. It was a problem to be solved. A creature was freezing. He brought it to warmth. He shouldered his way into Doc's cabin without knocking. Doc Irwin looking up from his papers with a grunt. "What in the blue blazes? Caleb? You finally snap and start carrying off livestock?" "Found her in the livery. She's frozen," Caleb said, laying her down on the examination cot. Doc was instantly professional. He ripped her glove off, cursing when he saw her fingers. He pressed his thumb to her wrist. "There's a pulse. Faint." He looked at Caleb. "Get out and send Mrs. Irwin in here if you see her." Caleb stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the woman's face, even unconscious. Her features were set in a look of profound defiance. Her dark lashes were stark against the pallor of her skin. It was not softness he saw. It was a quiet strength, a stubbornness that resonated with the granite of the mountains around them. Something stirred in his chest, a dull, unfamiliar ache that was not grief. It unsettled him. He turned without a word and left, the feeling of her slight weight still lingering in his arms. Mira woke to warmth. It was a thick, suffocating heat, and she panicked, thinking of fire. She sat up, her head spinning. She was in a small, clean room, smelling of carbolic acid and old wood. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated heat. Her clothes were gone, replaced by a rough linen nightshirt. "Easy, child. You're safe." An older woman, stout and gray-haired, was rocking in a chair, knitting. This was Mrs. Irwin, the doctor's wife. But the voice that had spoken was sharper. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the gray morning light, was another woman. She was thin, dressed in severe black, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. This was Mrs. Dunn, the pastor's wife. "You gave us all quite a fright." "Mrs." Dunn said, her voice holding no fright at all, only assessment. "Mr. Wright found you, collapsed in the livery. A most improper place for a young woman to be." Mira's throat was raw. "My horse," she rasped. "Mr. Hames is seeing to it." "Mrs." Dunn said, dismissing the concern. "The question is, what are we to do with you? We run a decent, God-fearing town here. Miss Thorne," Mira said, her voice stronger. "Mira Thorne. Miss Thorne. We have no room for vagrants, or worse." The implication hung in the air, heavy and sour. "Mrs." Dunn looked at Mira's dark hair, her face, and saw exactly what Reverend Blackwood had seen. Trouble. A harlot. Mira pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. She was used to this look. She met Mrs. Dunn's gaze and held it, her own spirit, though weakened, still bold. She said nothing. The silence was her only armor. "Mrs." Dunn sniffed, clearly displeased by the lack of cowering. "You can rest here for the day. Doc Irwin's orders. Then you must make arrangements. The church does not condone idleness." She left, a cloud of judgment following her out the door. Caleb had spent the night restless. The image of the woman's face wouldn't leave him. He had seen her boots, left by the door at Doc's. They were paper-thin, split at the sole, offering no protection. He thought of Sarah's feet, always cold. He thought of Alara's tiny, bright stockings. He found himself riding into town early, the storm having broken. He didn't go to Doc's. He didn't want to see her. He didn't want the complication, but he found himself at the Mercantile, waiting for Mr. Soper to open. He bought the best boots Soper had, sheepskin-lined, thick leather, and sturdy. They cost nearly a month's worth of supply money. He also bought a heavy wool blanket, the color of pine needles. He rode to Doc Irwin's. He didn't knock. He left the blanket and the boots on the porch, propped against the door where she would have to see them. He felt unsettled, angry at himself for this. Feeling. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, needing the clean, cold air of the high country. The next morning, Mira was stiff and sore, but the fever had broken. Mrs. Irwin, kinder than the pastor's wife, had given her a bowl of thin broth and left her to dress in her own clothes, now dry and stiff. She was pulling on her stockings when she saw them. The boots. They were sitting by the door, beside a folded wool blanket. She touched them. They were new. The leather was supple, the lining thick and soft. She looked at the price tag Soper had forgotten to remove. Her stomach tightened. This was more money than she had seen in a year. It was a debt, a chain. Kindness from a stranger was never free. She knew that better than anyone. It always came with an expectation, a price she was unwilling to pay. She felt a surge of anger. She looked at her old, cracked shoes. She couldn't wear them, but she couldn't accept them, barefoot, holding the expensive boots in one hand. She opened the cabin door. The morning was bright, the new snow blinding. The cold hit her feet like 1,000 needles, a sharp, clean pain that focused her mind. She stepped out onto the porch, hugging herself against the cold. She needed to find the man who had done this, the man who had carried her. And then she saw him. He was not coming to the cabin. He was walking away from the small church at the end of the street, his head down, his shoulders heavy under his big coat. He was walking with the lonely, deliberate pace of a man who visits a graveyard. He passed the end of Dock Street without turning his head. He didn't look at the cabin. He didn't see her standing there, barefoot in the snow, holding the boots he had left behind. He just kept walking, a solitary, silent figure moving toward the wilderness, leaving her alone with a gift she could neither accept nor refuse. The steam in the wash house behind the Belridge Inn was thick enough to chew. It smelled of lye soap, wet wool, and the sour perspiration of a dozen travelers. A heavy, suffocating fog that clung to Mira Thorne's skin and plastered her dark hair to her forehead. Her hands, once accustomed to turning the thin pages of hymnals and geography textbooks, were now red and swollen. The knuckles cracked from the biting cold water and the harsh chemicals. She plunged a heavy cotton sheet into the boiling vat, using a wooden paddle to churn it. Her shoulders burned with a fatigue that went down to the bone. It had been 2 weeks since she had walked out of Doc Irwin's cabin with the boots Caleb Wright had bought her. And in that time, she had learned exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of Belridge. She stood at the bottom, below the miners who spent their wages on rot-gut whiskey, below the trappers who smelled of beaver musk and blood, and certainly far below the righteous women of the church circle who crossed the street when they saw her coming. Mira accepted the position. It was survival. She had secured a room in the attic of the livery stable in exchange for mucking out stalls in the pre-dawn hours. And she had talked the innkeeper, a fleshy, sweating man named Silas Gable, into letting her take over the laundry. It paid pennies, barely enough for bread and coffee, but it was work. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, wincing as the soap stung a fresh crack in her skin. Through the frosted window pane, she could see the distorted shapes of people passing by on the boardwalk. She kept her head down. That was the rule she had set for herself. Be invisible, be useful, give them no reason to light the match. But invisibility was difficult when you looked like her. The rumors had started before the first snow had even settled on the roof of the inn. They swirled through the town like a draft, unseen but impossible to ignore. Men lingered a little too long by the wash-house door, their eyes sliding over her sodden dress with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. They made wagers on where she had come from, and why a woman with the carriage of a lady was scrubbing sheets like a scullery maid. The women were crueler. Mrs. Dunn, the pastor's wife, had let it be known that Mira's presence was a blight. They whispered in the mercantile, their voices dropping when Mira entered to buy a tin of beans. She heard the words harlot, tempter, and half-breed hissed behind gloved hands. She felt their eyes on her back, sharp as skinning knives. She was used to it. She had grown up watching her mother endure the same pointed silences and loud whispers. She knew how to build a wall of stone around her heart, brick by brick. But God, she was tired. Caleb Wright had noticed the tiredness. He had been coming into town more frequently since the day he found her. He told himself it was because the winter was harsher than usual, requiring more frequent trips for grain and nails. He told himself he needed to check on the market prices for beef. He lied to himself with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 2 years in silence. He saw her everywhere. He saw her in the early mornings, breaking the ice on the horse troughs outside the livery, her breath puffing white in the gray light. He saw her hauling baskets of wet laundry through the snow, her small frame bent under the weight. He saw the way the men watched her, like wolves circling a straggler, and the way the women cut her with their eyes. He was standing on the porch of the mercantile, a sack of flour on his shoulder. when he heard two miners talking near the hitching post. "Seen the washerwoman?" One chuckled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Dark eyes like that. You know she's got fire in her. Reckon for $1 she'd warm a man's bed fast enough? Reckon she's already warmed plenty." The other laughed. "That's why she's here. Run off from somewhere decent." Caleb felt a cold heat rise in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the sharp agony of grief. It was the dull throb of anger. He stepped off the porch, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't say a word. He simply walked past the men, passing so close that his shoulder brushed the speaker, jarring him. Caleb stopped and turned his head, his eyes flat and hard as slate. The miner swallowed his laugh. Taking a step back, Caleb held the look for a long second, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and dangerous. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't believe the whispers. He had carried her. He had seen the fierce, terrified exhaustion in her face. He knew what a woman looked like when she was broken by the world, and he knew what a woman looked like when she was selling herself. Mira Thorne looked like neither. She looked like a soldier holding a lost position. Later that week, the snow abated, leaving the town buried under 3 feet of white powder. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue. Mira finished the washing early and made her way to the back of the livery stable. This was her secret rebellion. It had started with a boy named Leo, the son of a Shoshone tracker and a washerwoman who had died of fever the year before. Leo was 10, wild as a coyote, and entirely illiterate. The town school, run by Mrs. Dunn, did not explicitly ban mixed-blood children, but it made them unwelcome enough that they never stayed. Mira had found Leo throwing rocks at the stable cats. Instead of scolding him, she had drawn a letter A in the dirt with a stick. Now, there were 4 of them. Leo, 2 sisters whose father had died in the mines, and a quiet, club-footed boy named Thomas. They sat on overturned feed buckets behind the stable, out of the wind, wrapped in threadbare coats. "Look here," Mira said, her voice soft but firm. She held up a slate she had salvaged from the trash heap behind the general store. On it, she had written 3 words: Mesa, Montana, Rio. "These are the words for the land we live in," she told them. "In English, table, mountain, river. In Spanish, Mesa, Montana, Rio. If you know both, you have 2 ways to understand the world, and the more ways you have to understand the world, the harder it is for people to fool you." Caleb had come to the livery to speak to Hames about a harness. He stopped when he heard her voice drifting from the alleyway. He moved quietly, peering around the corner of the weathered wood. She was transformed. The exhaustion that pulled at her features in the wash-house was gone. Her eyes were bright, her hands animated as she pointed to the distant peaks, explaining the geography of the pass. She spoke to these cast-off children with a seriousness and respect that most adults in Belridge never showed them. She wasn't just teaching them words. She was giving them dignity. Caleb watched her for a long time, forgetting about the harness. He watched the way she gently corrected Leo's pronunciation, the way she wrapped her own scarf around the smallest girl when she shivered. A strange pressure built behind his ribs. He had thought her merely a survivor. Now he saw she was something more dangerous. She was a builder. She was trying to build something green and living in the middle of a frozen wasteland. He stepped back before she could see him, unsettled by how much he wanted to stay and listen. 2 days later, dusk was falling purple and heavy over the valley. Mira was walking back from the tree line, a bundle of kindling tied with twine slung over her back. The wood was wet and heavy, digging into her shoulder. She slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow, going down hard on one knee. The wood spilled, scattering across the path. She stayed there for a moment, head bowed, breathing hard. She didn't cry. She just stared at the snow, willing the strength to return to her legs. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, looking up to see Caleb Wright towering above her. He was backlit by the fading sun, a giant in a shearling coat. He didn't speak. He simply knelt and began gathering the wood. His hands, gloved in heavy leather, were efficient. He tied the bundle back together with a few sharp tugs, then stood, lifting the wood as if it weighed no more than a sack of feathers. He offered her a hand. Mira hesitated. She looked at the large, open palm. Then, slowly, she reached out. His grip was warm and solid. He pulled her up, and for a moment they were standing close, the air between them charged with the scent of pine and cold wool. As her sleeve slipped back, the fading light caught the pale, jagged lines of old scars on the inside of her wrist. Caleb saw them. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with judgment, but with recognition. He knew scars. He had enough of them in his own heart. Mira yanked her hand away, pulling her sleeve down, her face flushing with shame. She reached for the wood he was holding. "I can take it," she said, her voice defensive. "I'm walking this way." Caleb lied. He lived 3 miles in the other direction. They walked in silence toward the livery. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the snow. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared space, a respite from the noise of the town. When they reached the back door of the stable, Caleb set the wood down on the dry porch. He turned to go, but Mira spoke, the question bursting out of her before she could stop it. "Why are you kind to me?" Caleb stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the suspicion in her eyes, the expectation of a blow or a proposition. It made his chest ache. "Why shouldn't I be?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel rolling in a stream bed. "Because no one else is," she said simply. "They think I'm—" She trailed off, unable to say the words. Caleb stepped closer. Just a single step, but it felt significant. He looked down at her, his blue eyes catching the last light of the day. "I don't care what they think," he said. "I care about what is—" He looked at her as if she were a fact, as if she were a truth he had discovered in the snow. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer false comfort. He just looked at her like she mattered, like she was a person, whole and real, standing in front of him. He tipped the brim of his hat and walked away into the twilight. That night, huddled under the expensive wool blanket in the hayloft, Mira opened her journal by the light of a tallow candle. She uncorked her small bottle of ink and dipped the pen. December 12th, 1883. The cold here is a living thing. It seeks to find the cracks in you and pry them open. But today, I found warmth where I did not expect it. He is a mountain of a man, silent as the stone. But he carries my burdens without asking for a coin or a kiss. He looked at me today, not at my face or my dress, but at me. I have met men with eyes like fire, and men with eyes like mud. But this man, he has eyes like thawing frost, cold. Yes, but with the promise that something lies beneath, waiting for the sun. The peace did not last. 3 days later, Mira walked into the wash house to find disaster. The vat of soaking linens, which had been full of white sheets for the inn's best rooms, was churning with a milky, acrid foam. The smell burned her nose the moment she opened the door. Lye. Someone had poured a concentrated jug of industrial lye directly into the soaking tub. Mira rushed forward, grabbing the tongs to pull a sheet out, but it disintegrated in her grip, falling apart into wet, chemical-burned shreds. The fabric was ruined. All of it. What in God's name is this stench? Silas Gable stood in the doorway, his face turning a mottled purple. He looked at the ruined sheets, then at Mira. "You clumsy, stupid girl," he roared. "Those were fine linens, imported from St. Louis." "I didn't do this," Mira said, her voice shaking. "Someone poured lye in the night. I locked the door. I swear." "Lie!" Gable stormed in, kicking the bucket. "You think I believe someone broke in just to ruin laundry? You mixed the solution wrong. You burned them. That's $50 of linen." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. "You'll pay for this. Every cent. You work for free until it's paid off, or I throw you out in the snow right now." "I can't work for free," Mira cried, trying to pull away. "I have to eat." "Then starve," Gable shouted, raising his hand as if to strike her. The door to the wash house slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot. Caleb stood there. He filled the frame, bringing the winter air in with him. He didn't look at Mira. He looked straight at Silas Gable. "Let her go," Caleb said. The volume of his voice was low, terrifyingly calm. Gable froze. He released Mira's arm, stepping back. "Now see here, right, this is my business. She destroyed my property." Caleb walked into the room. He looked at the vat, smelling the air. He looked at the broken lock on the side door, which Gable had ignored. "She didn't do this," Caleb said, "and you know it." "I don't know any such thing. And even if she didn't, she's responsible. I'm out $50. Caleb reached into his coat. He didn't pull out money. He pulled out a leather glove and began to slowly pull it on, smoothing the fingers. "Silas," Caleb said, "you buy 3 sides of beef from me every month for your kitchen. You buy 4 cords of my wood to heat your rooms." Gable blinked, sweating despite the cold. "Yes, so?" "If you touch her again," Caleb said, looking at the man with absolute disinterest, "or if you make her pay for vandalism she didn't commit, I will stop selling to you, today. And I'll tell the boys at the ranch to tell every cattleman from here to Helena that the Belridge Inn serves horse meat." Gable paled. The winter season relied on the ranchers and the drovers. Losing Caleb's beef, and his endorsement, would cripple him. That's unreasonable. "Caleb, over a washerwoman?" "She's not a washerwoman," Caleb said. "She's a citizen of this town. Treat her like one." He turned to Mira. "Finish your work. He won't bother you." Caleb walked out, leaving Gable sputtering and Mira staring at his retreating back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He had just leveraged his livelihood for her, for a woman he barely spoke to. The week leading up to Christmas brought a heavy, hushed beauty to the valley. The sabotage stopped, though the whispers didn't. But Mira felt lighter. She had a protector, even if a distant one. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, the sky was the color of pearl. Mira had gathered the children behind the stable. It was too cold to sit for long, but she had a surprise. She had found a fallen pine branch, thick and green. She had spent the night before tying small scraps of red fabric, remnants from a torn shirt, onto the needles. She had polished small river stones until they shone and tied them on with thread. "It's a Christmas tree," Leo said, his eyes wide. "It's a piece of one," Mira smiled, her breath misting. "But it's ours. In my mother's country, we would light candles, but here we have snow. Look." She shook the branch gently. The snow dust on the needles caught the light, sparkling like diamond dust. "It's magic," little Thomas whispered. Mira laughed. It was a genuine sound, bubbling up from a place she thought had gone dry. She threw her head back, the sound ringing clear and sweet in the crisp air. She spun around, holding the branch up for the children to see. Caleb was watching from the livery doorway. He had been about to mount his horse to ride back to his lonely cabin, but the sound of her laugh stopped him dead. It hit him in the center of his chest, cracking the ice that had encased his heart for 2 years. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of defiance against the dark. He watched her face, flushed with cold and joy, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. He realized then, with a jolt of terror and wonder, that he didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to be the reason she laughed like that. That night, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the livery stable. Caleb had stayed in town, claiming his horse had thrown a shoe. Though Hames looked at the perfectly good shoe and said nothing, Caleb found her in the stable proper, sitting on a bale of hay near Viento's stall. A lantern burned low beside her. She wasn't laughing now. She was crying. She held a piece of paper in her hands, worn thin at the folds. She was reading it, over and over, her tears making dark spots on her skirt. Caleb approached slowly. The straw muffled his steps, but she sensed him. She looked up, hastily wiping her eyes, trying to hide the paper. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll be quiet." "You're not loud," Caleb said. He sat down on a crate opposite her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He pointed to the paper. "From home?" Mira looked at the letter. From my mother. She wrote it before she died. That's all I have left of her voice. She traced the ink with a trembling finger. She told me to be brave. She said the world would try to eat me, and I had to be indigestible. A watery smile touched her lips. I don't feel very brave tonight. Caleb, I feel small. It was the first time she had used his name. Caleb looked at her. He saw the cracks in the armor she wore so well. He saw the lonely girl beneath the defiant woman. Without thinking, he reached out. He placed his large, rough hand on her shoulder. She flinched, expecting pain, but his touch was gentle, grounding. It was a heavy, warm weight that seemed to say, I'm here, you are not floating away. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, just a fraction of an inch. Her head bowed, her breathing hitching as she fought the sobs. They sat there in the dim amber light of the lantern, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses. The wind howled outside, tearing at the world, but inside the circle of light, there was a fragile, terrified peace. Caleb's thumb brushed the fabric of her dress, a microscopic caress. He felt the heat of her skin through the cloth. You don't have to be brave all the time, he said, his voice low and rumbled. Not tonight. Mira looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. She saw the thawing frost in his gaze. She saw the man who had lost everything, reaching out to the woman who had nothing. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel cold. The wind, when it finally stilled, left behind a silence that was louder and more menacing than the howling. It was the morning of December 22nd, and the air over Belridge had turned heavy. Holding its breath, Caleb stood outside the livery, his gaze fixed on the sky in the northwest. It was a sickly, bruised yellow, a color that promised ice, not just snow. He found Mira in the wash house, scrubbing the last of Gable's linens. She had not been bothered again, but the truce was cold and thin. A storm is coming, he said. He didn't bother with a greeting. His voice was flat, a statement of fact, like a man reading a telegram. Mira stopped, her hands submerged in the gray, sudsy water. She looked at his reflection in the dark, wavy glass of the window. I've seen storms, Mr. Right. Not like this one, he said. He turned to face her, filling the doorway. This is a high country killer. It will come down off the peaks tonight. It will be ice first, then snow. It won't stop for a week. Maybe more. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron, her body tensing. She knew survival. She knew when a man was telling the truth. Mister, Gable lets me use the attic room. The attic in the livery? Caleb's tone was sharp. That roof is rotted. There will be heavy snow. It'll come down on your head before the second day. You'll freeze or be crushed. Mira stared at him, her dark eyes wide and wary. She saw no lie in his face, but she saw the one thing she feared more than a blizzard. A proposition, an expectation, the price for the boots and the blanket. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not going to find you frozen in a stable again, he said, his voice rough. My cabin, it's high, but it's built of stone. It will hold. The air left her lungs. There it was, the invitation. She thought of the men at the missionary school, of Reverend Blackwood, of all the kindnesses that were just traps. I cannot accept, Mr. Right. This isn't an invitation to tea, Miss Thorne, he said, his patience snapping. This is a hole in the ground while a bear is coming. You can be proud in the attic, or you can be alive in the cabin. I don't care much about the propriety of it. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, at the eyes that held no heat, only a fierce, impersonal kind of sense. He wasn't looking at her like the miners. He was looking at her like a rancher checking on his stock, a cold, practical assessment. It was, strangely, a relief. It was a language she understood. I have my own horse, she said, her voice small. We rode for 1 hour, he said, and walked away. She packed her few belongings in a canvas sack, her journal, her mother's letter, the sewing kit, a change of stockings. She told Hames she was leaving, and he just nodded, his eyes on the same sickly sky Caleb had seen. She met Caleb at the edge of town. They rode out in silence, two small figures against the vast, waiting white. The land was treacherous, the silence profound, as if the world was holding its breath. The wind, when it began, did not whistle. It moaned, a low, keening sound that slipped under their collars. It sounded, Mira thought, like old ghosts, warning them back. Caleb just leaned into it, his shoulders set, a man riding into a familiar battle. They climbed out of the valley. Viento, her Mustang, struggling to keep pace with Caleb's big roar. The snow was deeper here, the trail a half-remembered line. Just as the sky opened and the first hard pellets of ice began to sting their faces, they reached the cabin. It was not a home. It was a fortress, a small, square structure of thick river stone and heavy timber, built to withstand the high country winters. It was dark, cold, and smelled of dust, old iron, and something faintly of pine. There was a small pot-bellied stove for cooking, a narrow cot, a table, and a massive fireplace, its hearth black and filled with the gray ash of a fire long dead. Mira shivered, pulling her thin coat tighter. Caleb went to the pot-bellied stove, not the hearth, and began skillfully building a fire, his large hands precise as he laid the kindling. "You don't use the fireplace?" Mira asked, her voice echoing slightly in the stone room. Caleb's hands stilled for a second. He did not look at her. "No." He got the stove lit, and a small circle of warmth began to push back against the gloom. The ice was hitting the roof now, a frantic, angry drumming. They settled into a tense quiet. Caleb unpacked his own supplies, flour, coffee, dried beef. Mira sat on a three-legged stool, her hands in her lap, feeling useless. Later, as the light outside failed completely, replaced by the white-gray of the storm, Mira looked again at the massive, cold fireplace. It was the heart of the cabin, and it was dead. "It would be warmer," she said quietly. "The stove is enough." His voice was a warning, but Mira was cold, and she was not a woman who knew how to be useless. She stood and walked to the hearth. She saw the heavy iron poker. She looked at him. "May I?" Caleb stared at her, his face a mask of granite. He looked at the hearth, and a shadow of such profound pain passed over his features that Mira nearly stepped back, but she held her ground. "Caleb?" she said, her voice soft. He turned away from her, walking to the single small window, staring out at the white fury he couldn't even see. "Do as you please, Miss Thorne." She took it as the permission it was. She knelt, took the small shovel, and began to clean out the old ash. It was 2 years of dust, of settled grief. When it was clean, she took kindling from the box, just as he had, and laid the logs. She built the fire, but she did not light it. She stood and looked at his back. "It's ready. Will you light it?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the shriek of the wind and the rattling of the ice. "I cannot," he whispered, the words torn from him. He turned, and the firelight from the small stove illuminated the truth of his face. The man on the ridge had been a ghost. This was the man. "This cabin," he said, his voice raw. "This isn't where... It wasn't here. It was the main house, down the valley." Mira just listened, her hands clasped. "2 Christmases ago, a lightning strike. I wasn't there. I was clearing timber. By the time I saw the smoke..." He stopped. His throat worked. The hearth in that house, it was the last thing Sarah stacked. She was so proud of it. We were supposed to light it together on Christmas morning. Alara, my daughter, she was 5. He looked at the fireplace she had prepared. "I haven't lit a hearth since... I won't..." Mira's heart ached. She did not go to him. She did not touch him. She understood. He was trapped by the fire, just as she had been. "I know what it is to watch something burn," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. He looked at her, his gaze sharpening. "My last position, the missionary school, the Reverend, he was not a good man. When his wife found out, she blamed me. They called me a harlot in front of the congregation." Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "A fire started in the schoolhouse," Mira continued, her eyes fixed on the unlit logs. "I don't know who said it, but I was blamed for that, too. I ran. Before that, my mother—" She paused. "She was what this town calls me. She was a prostitute, but she was a healer, too. She taught me to read. She taught me about plants that could stop a fever." She looked up at Caleb. "A fever came. The town doctor wouldn't see her. He said her kind brought their own sickness. She died of it. She burned up from the inside, and I was too small to save her." They stood in the cold cabin. 2 survivors, one marked by fever, one by fire. Mira picked up a match. She struck it, the flare harsh in the gloom. "This isn't that fire, Caleb. This is just a fire, and we are cold." She touched the match to the kindling. The flame caught, small and yellow, then grew, finding the dry wood. It roared to life. Caleb flinched as if struck. He watched the flames, his whole body trembling. He didn't run. He just stood, watching the light push the shadows from the corners of the room. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 2 years. Later that night, the cabin was warm for the first time. The blizzard had fully arrived, trapping them. The sound of the wind was a constant, high-pitched scream. But inside, the fire held. Caleb watched Mira. She had fallen asleep on a bedroll he'd laid out for her, as close to the hearth as she could get without scorching. She was curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, the firelight catching the blue-black of her hair. He had watched his wife sleep. He had watched his daughter sleep. This was different. This was watching a stranger who wasn't a stranger. He watched her sleep, and he felt not grief, but a quiet, terrifying presence. The next day, the storm was a solid wall of white. They were prisoners. The intimacy of their confessions hung between them. Not awkward, but solid. They moved around each other, sharing chores. He brought in more wood. She found his mending kit. His coat, the heavy shearling, had a long tear in the sleeve. While he was outside checking on the livestock in the small, sheltered barn, she took it. She sat by the fire, her mother's thimble on her finger, and began to sew. Her stitches were small and perfect. She was mending his armor. When he came back in, stamping the snow from his boots, he saw her. He stopped. He just watched her fingers work, the needle flashing in the firelight. When she finished, she bit the thread and held it up. "It will hold," she said. He just nodded, removing the coat, his fingers brushing hers. The warmth from her hand shot up his arm, a jolt of life. On the second night, the blizzard reached its peak. The world was gone. There was only the cabin. The tension that had held them was beginning to wear them down. They were 2 people, not just 2 ghosts. Caleb found a stone jug in the bottom of his supply chest. "Cider," he said. "From before." He warmed it on the stove with a tin of cinnamon he'd forgotten he had. He poured it into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. It was hot, sweet, and sharp. They drank. "My friend," Mira said, a small smile touching her lips. "Leo, the boy in town. He asked me if I could teach him to talk to squirrels. I told him I didn't speak to squirrels. He said, 'That's all right, Miss Mira, I'll teach you.'" Caleb looked at her, and a strange thing happened. The corner of his mouth twitched. Mira's smile widened. "He said the first word is chicked, which means, 'Give me that nut.'" A sound rumbled in Caleb's chest. It was dry, rusty, like an old hinge. It was a laugh. He laughed, and the sound of it made her laugh, a real, bubbling laugh, the one he had heard in the alley. It filled the cabin, bright and alive. It broke something open in him. It was the sound of everything he had lost, returned to him in a new, strange form. He felt his heart kick, a heavy, painful beat. He was alive. Later, the fire burned low. They were on their separate bedrolls, on opposite sides of the hearth. The cider was gone. The laughter faded, leaving a warm, comfortable silence. Then Mira screamed. It was not a small cry. It was a raw, terrified shriek that cut through the sound of the wind. "Fire! No, it's burning!" She was sitting bolt upright, her eyes wide and unseeing, tangled in her blankets. Caleb was across the room before he was even awake. He didn't think so. He reacted. He grabbed her, his hands hard on her shoulders. "Mira, wake up! You're safe!" He was fierce, instinctive, shaking her from the nightmare. She gasped, her eyes focusing on him. She was trembling violently, her skin cold. "Caleb," she breathed. The nightmare was still clinging to her. "The fire! I smelled it." "There's no fire," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Only the hearth. You're safe. It's just snow." He was still holding her. His hands were on her upper arms, his thumbs brushing the thin fabric of her shirt. Their faces were inches apart. The only light came from the glowing red embers in the fireplace. They were breathing each other's air, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke, cider, and the clean scent of snow he'd brought in on his clothes. She looked at him, her chest heaving. She felt the solid, living heat of him. He was an anchor. He was the wall. "Don't let go," she whispered. It was not a request. It was a plea. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. He saw the fear, but he also saw the woman. The one who had lit his fire, the one who had sewn his coat, the one who had made him laugh. He lowered his head. The kiss was tentative. It was a question. His lips, chapped and cold from the wind, brushed hers. She didn't pull away. She made a small sound in the back of her throat, a sound of surrender. He deepened it. It was desperate. It was 2 years of silence, 2 years of grief, 2 years of a dead, cold heart. It was a lifetime of running, of being hungry, of being cold. It was all their loneliness, all their loss, poured into one frantic moment. She clutched at his shirt, her fingers digging in. Then she broke away, breathless, her lips swollen. She stared at him, her eyes wide, terrified of what they had just done. But she stayed close. She didn't retreat. She stayed inside the circle of his arms. Caleb looked at her, the firelight reflecting in her dark, tear-filled eyes. He thought of the wish he had made on the ridge, the hollow, nameless wish for her, and he knew her name now. "All I want for Christmas," he said, his voice thick, broken. "All I've ever wanted is you." It was not a joke. It was not a line. It was a prayer. She saw the truth of it in his eyes, the awful, beautiful, terrifying truth. She didn't speak. She reached up and touched the scar on his jaw, the one he'd gotten from the fire. He closed his eyes at her touch. He was a man. She was a woman. They were alive, and they were alone, shut away from the world by a wilderness of ice. He lifted her, his hands gentle now, and carried her the few feet to his bedroll, the one nearest the fire. He laid her down, and for a moment, they were hesitant. They were two broken things, afraid to touch for fear of shattering. But the need was greater than the fear. It was intense. It was raw. It was unguarded. This was not a soft union. It was a collision. It was the frantic, desperate claiming of life in the face of death. It was every whispered insult Mira had ever endured, and every silent day Caleb had suffered. It was the mending of the coat and the lighting of the hearth. It was the shedding of ghosts. After, in the warm, dim quiet of the cabin, with the blizzard a distant roar, Mira cried. She wept silently, the tears rolling hot down her temples and into her hair. It was not a cry of sadness. It was the breaking of the dam. It was the release of years of terror, of loneliness, of bitterness. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort her with words. He simply pulled the blankets over them, wrapped his arms around her, and held her. He pressed his forehead against hers, their skin damp, their breathing slowing together. They were both shaking. The blizzard broke on the fourth morning, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had been remade. The sun, when it rose, was a violent, blinding thing, shattering off 1,000,000 acres of fresh, unbroken snow. The world was new, and so were they. Inside the small stone cabin, a new dynamic had settled. The frantic, desperate collision of the first night had given way to a shy, tender awareness. They moved around each other with the careful grace of two people who had seen the other's wounds. They didn't ride back to Belridge. Neither of them spoke of it. The path would be impassable for at least a day. But that was an excuse. The cabin, which had been Caleb's prison, had become their sanctuary. A small pocket of warmth and life sealed off from the judgment of the world. They began to act like a couple, falling into a simple, unspoken rhythm. In the morning, he would rise first, his movements quiet, and add wood to the hearth. By the time he came back in from checking the animals, stamping the snow from his boots, she would have the coffee pot simmering on the stove grate. "It's too strong," she teased him on the 5th morning, her voice still rough with sleep as she sipped from the tin cup. A man could shoe a horse with this coffee. Caleb, who was cleaning his rifle at the table, stopped, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his mouth. "It's coffee, Miss Thorne. It's meant to wake you, not coddle you. It's meant to be drunk, Mr. Right, not chewed." He met her gaze over the rifle barrel, and the look that passed between them was so warm, so full of a new, shared understanding, that Mira had to look away, her cheeks flushing. She found herself looking for things to do, ways to lay claim to the small space, to make it hers, if only for a day. While he was outside splitting a new cord of wood, the steady thwack of his axe a heartbeat against the silence, Mira took to tidying the cabin's few possessions. He had a small collection of books, their spines cracked, Shakespeare, a book on animal husbandry, the Bible, and she stacked them neatly. At the bottom of the supply chest, beneath a canvas tarp, her fingers brushed against something wooden. She pulled it out. It was a small, crudely carved chest, no bigger than a bread box. With a simple latch, she opened it. Inside, on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a doll. It was simple, whittled from a single piece of pine. The face was just 2 shallow divots for eyes and a small, unsmiling line for a mouth. Its hair was made of thick, unraveling strands of yellow yarn. It wore a dress, perfectly stitched, from a scrap of blue calico. Mira knew, instantly, who it had belonged to. Ilara. She lifted it, her touch full of a reverence she hadn't known she possessed. It was just wood and yarn, but it was the relic of a lost life, the focus of a love so big it had left a crater in the man outside. She touched the yarn hair, smoothed the tiny calico skirt, her heart aching with a complex sorrow for the little girl who had played with it, for the mother who had sewn the dress, and for the man who had buried them both. The sound of the axe stopped. She heard his footsteps on the porch, the heavy scrape of his boots. He entered, his arms full of firewood, his face flushed from the cold. He stopped dead. He saw her, standing by the open chest, the doll in her hands. The warmth evaporated from the room. A terrible, cold silence filled the space. The silence Mira remembered from his first days in town. He didn't move. He just stared at the doll, his face a mask of stone. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed. Mira's throat tightened. She thought he would yell, that he would banish her, that this was the line she had crossed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. I found the chest." She made to put the doll back, but his voice, low and rough, stopped her. Ilara, she called her Sunshine, because of the hair." He dropped the wood into the box by the hearth, the sound unnaturally loud. He walked over, not to Mira, but to the chest. He held out his large, calloused hand. Mira gently placed the doll in his palm. He stared at it for a long, agonizing minute. His thumb, rough and stained, stroked the yarn hair. He did not cry. He just breathed, a long, shuddering intake of air. Then, with a tenderness that shattered Mira's heart, he placed the doll back on its velvet bed and closed the lid of the chest. He turned, not to her, but to the small, frost-covered window. He looked out at the white expanse of his land. "I haven't opened that box since the day I packed it," he said. Mira came to stand beside him, not touching, just sharing the view. She was loved. Caleb, I can see it, in every stitch. He nodded, a sharp, painful movement, to break the new, heavy silence. Mira spoke of the only thing she could. Before the storm, I was teaching the children in town, Leo and the Miller girls, just reading and numbers. Caleb remained silent, but she knew he was listening. I found a spot behind the livery. It was cold, but it was out of the wind. She smiled sadly. It wasn't much of a school. Caleb was quiet for another minute. Then he pointed, his arm extending, toward a low-slung building about 100 yards from the cabin, half buried in a drift. The old bunkhouse, he said. Before I built the main house, when I had more hands, it's solid. Good light from the south windows. Mira turned to look at him. What are you saying? It's empty, he said, finally turning to look at her. It's got a stove. It's bigger than this cabin, and it's a long way from Mrs. Done. A wild, impossible hope flared in Mira's chest. A school. A real school. With walls, and a stove, and a home. The hope died as quickly as it came. The fear, her old, familiar companion, rushed back in. Caleb, I can't, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Don't you see? I bring trouble. I told you, the Reverend's wife. The fire. I can't stay anywhere too long. They'll find a way to run me out. They always do. And this time, they'll run you out, too, for harboring me. This is my land, he said, his voice a low growl. No one runs me from my land. He stepped closer, taking her face in his hands. His palms were rough from the axe, but his touch was gentle. Mira, this land is trouble. The cold is troublesome. The winter is troublesome. You're not in trouble. Your life. He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You don't have to run anymore. She looked at him, at the thawing frost in his eyes, and for a single, terrifying second, she believed him. That night, the fire burned low, casting warm, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The desperation of their first coupling was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet longing. The intimacy of the day, the shared chores, the doll, the talk of a future, had woven a new, stronger thread between them. He was sitting on the hearth, mending a piece of harness. She was on the bedroll, reading from his copy of Shakespeare, her voice a low murmur. She looked up, and their eyes met. He put the harness down. She closed the book. He came to her, kneeling on the bedroll. He didn't kiss her, he just looked at her, learning the lines of her face in the firelight. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice raw with the truth. So am I, he breathed. This time, it was slow. It was a discovery. He unlaced her boots and chafed her cold feet in his hands. He unbraided her hair, his fingers careful as they worked the long, dark strands, letting them fall over her shoulders. She rose to her knees, pushing the rough fabric of his shirt off his shoulders. And for the first time, she saw the scars on his back and arms, the old, puckered skin from the fire he had run into, the fire that had taken everything. She kissed each one, a silent, healing benediction. She was on top, her hair curtaining them, her body poised above his. She was in control, and it was a new, frightening, beautiful feeling. She looked down at him, at the man who had seen her at her most broken, and she felt, for the first time, powerful. She was not a victim. She was a woman, choosing. She whispered her fears into the hollow of his throat, the words she had never told another soul. She told him about the miner's eyes, about the reverend's hands, about the terror of being seen as nothing but a body to be used and discarded. And Caleb learned her body as if it were sacred text. He kissed the pale, jagged scars on her wrists with a tenderness that made her weep. He learned the curve of her spine, the sensitive skin behind her ear, the way she arched her back when he touched her hip. He moved slowly, with a patience he usually reserved for breaking a wild horse, a patience that was a form of worship. When they came together, it was not a collision. It was a merger. It was a promise, sealed in the flesh, in the firelight, in the heart of the winter. The ride back to Belridge 2 days later was quiet, The world was bright and clean, the path packed down enough for the horses, but the bubble had burst. With every step the horses took down the pass, Mira felt the cold air of reality seeping back in. They rode into town not as two separate people, but together. Caleb didn't drop her at the livery and ride on. He rode beside her, down the center of Main Street, his face set, daring anyone to speak. It was all the town needed. The explosion was not immediate. It was a slow burn. It started with the stairs. When Mira walked into the mercantile, the conversation stopped dead. Mrs. Soper, who had once given Caleb extra apples, now counted Mira's pennies with a pinched, sour look. The men who had leered before now looked at her with a different, sharper interest. She was not just a half-breed washerwoman. She was Caleb Wright's something. She was a conquest, or she was a witch who had ensnared the town's most tragic figure. The children, Leo, Thomas, the Miller girls, ran to her, but their parents were quick to follow, yanking them away, their faces masks of fear and anger. "You stay away from her, Leo," Leo's uncle hissed, dragging the boy by the arm. "She's unclean." The architect of the campaign was, as always, Mrs. Dunn. She saw Mira leaving the mercantile, her small bag of flour clutched to her chest. "The devil finds warmth in high, lonely places, Miss Thorne," Mrs. Dunn said, her voice loud enough for the 3 other women on the boardwalk to hear. "But the fires of God find sinners even in a blizzard." Mira kept walking, her head high, but the word was out. Sinner. It all came to a head on Sunday. Mira knew it was a mistake, but she had to go. She had to show them she was not a creature of the shadows. She had to show Caleb that his faith in her was not misplaced. She put on her one clean dress, brushed her hair until it shone, and walked to the church. She sat in the back pew, alone. The service began. Pastor Dunn, a pale man with nervous hands, avoided looking at her. His sermon was about the prodigal son. But when he finished, his wife, Mrs. Dunn, did not sit. She stood. She turned, her black-gloved finger pointing straight at Mira. "Pastor, you speak of sin, but you ignore the sinner in our midst." Her voice was a shrill blade. "There is a woman here who left this town in the company of a man, unblessed by God. She lived with him, in sin, for a week, and now she returns, bold as brass, to sit among decent folk. She who corrupts our children with her foreign ways, who lures a grieving widower into her bed." The entire congregation turned. 200 eyes, sharp with judgment, pinned Mira to the pew. She felt the blood drain from her face. She was trapped. There was no escape. "She is a harlot," Mrs. Dunn shrieked. "A painted Jezebel, and she must be cast out." Mira stood, her body trembling, her pride in tatters. She was going to run. The main doors of the church slammed open. The sound was like a cannon shot in the holy silence. Caleb Wright stood silhouetted against the bright morning snow. He was in his work clothes. He had not come for the service. He had come for her. He walked down the center aisle. His steps were heavy, deliberate, echoing in the cavernous room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He did not look left or right. He walked until he was standing in the aisle, level with Mira's pew. He did not look at her. He looked at Pastor Dunn, who was shrinking behind the pulpit. "Pastor," Caleb's voice was a low growl, filling the church. "You let this woman speak lies in God's house. Now see here, Mr. Right," the pastor stammered. "This is a house of decency." "Is it?" Caleb said. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the silent, staring faces. "She teaches your children," he pointed at Mrs. Dunn. "Not you. Her." He turned back to the pastor. "She teaches your children what you never will. She teaches them to read. She teaches them that the world is bigger than Belridge. She teaches them dignity. She teaches them that their blood, no matter where it comes from, is not a sin." He took a step closer to the pulpit, a menacing, powerful figure. "All you teach them is fear. Fear of God. Fear of damnation. Fear of anyone who is different. He turned to Mira. The entire church held its breath. He held out his hand. "Come." She looked at his hand, then at his face. He had just declared war on the entire town. For her. She put her trembling hand in his. He pulled her into the aisle and, without a backward glance, led her out of the church. The doors closed behind them, leaving the congregation in a stunned, righteous silence. Outside, the air was cold. Mira was shaking, a mixture of humiliation, fury, and a terrible, aching love. "You've ruined yourself," she whispered, pulling her hand from his. "You've destroyed your name. For me, I've ruined you." "My name is my own," he said, his face hard. "Let them talk." "Talk," she cried. "They won't just talk. They will destroy you. They will stop buying your beef, your wood. They will freeze you out, just like they did me. I can't be the one who does that to you. I can't." She pulled away from him and ran. She didn't run to the livery. She ran to the small alley where she had taught her children, as if they could save her. She sank down behind a stack of barrels, her body racked with sobs. She had to leave. It was the only way to save him. Later that afternoon, a new storm began to blow. The sky turned gray, and a thin, driving snow began to fall. Hames was in the livery, shaking his head. "It's a bad one. Miss Mira," he said, watching her throw a saddle on Viento. "You can't ride in this. You'll be lost in an hour." "I have to," she said, her fingers fumbling with the cinch, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "I can't stay, but Mr. Wright, he's the reason I'm going," she said. She put her foot in the stirrup and hauled herself up. She rode Viento out into the swirling snow, a ghost leaving a haunted town. She didn't get far. The wind was a physical blow, pushing her back, the snow stinging her eyes. At the edge of town, where the trail began its climb into the pass, a figure on a large roan gelding blocked the path. He was just sitting there, his hat pulled low, a dusting of snow on his shoulders. He had been waiting. "Get out of my way! Caleb!" she yelled over the wind. "No," he said. "I'm poisoned," she screamed, the word torn from her. "Don't you understand? Everything I touch, I burn. I told you. I burned the school. I've burned your good name. Let me go." He kneed his horse forward, pushing through the deepening drift until they were knee to knee. He reached out and grabbed Viento's bridle, his grip iron. He looked at her, his face carved from ice and fury, his eyes burning with a light that warmed her to the bone. "Run if you want," he said, his voice a raw command that cut through the howl of the storm. "I can't stop you from running, but don't lie to me. Don't stand there in a blizzard and lie to my face and say you don't want to stay." The snow swirled between them, a frantic, white curtain. Mira sat on her horse, her hands frozen to the reins. The sobs choked in her throat. She was poisoned. She was ruined. She had just seen the proof in the house of God, had seen the good, silent man in front of her trade his name for hers. "Let me go, Caleb," she whispered, her voice a raw plea against the wind. "I'm saving you." "Saving me," he repeated, and the sound was a low, bitter laugh that the wind snatched away. He still had his hand on Viento's bridle. He was the anchor, and she was the ship, trying to tear free and founder in the storm. "Don't lie to me," he had said, and that was the final, terrible blow. She could not. She could lie to Mrs. Done. She could lie to the world. She could even lie to herself. But she could not lie to him. Not here, not in the heart of the blizzard he had pulled her from. Her shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her, leaving a cold, hard knot of truth. "I don't want to run," she admitted, the words barely audible. "I am so tired. I'm so tired of running." "Then stop," he said. He let go of her bridle. It was a test. The pass was open. He would not hold her. Mira looked at the swirling white abyss in front of her, the future she had always known. Then she looked back at the man, his shoulders solid as the mountains, his face raw with a feeling she was too terrified to name. She pulled her horse's head around, slowly, deliberately. She turned her back on the storm and the pass. She did not ride to the livery. She rode, side by side with him, through the stunned, shuttered main street of Belridge and up the pass toward the stone cabin. She had made her choice. That night, the storm, which had held off, returned with a new fury. They sat by the hearth, the wind screaming, the stones of the cabin vibrating. The world was trying to tear them apart. "You have to marry me," he said. The words dropped into the silence between them like stones. Mira stopped breathing. She looked up from the fire. He was not looking at her. He was staring into the flames, his face grim. "No," she said, her voice shaking. He turned, his eyes flashing. "What?" "No," she said, stronger now. Standing up. "Is that what this is? You saved me from the storm? You saved me from the church, and now you have to save me from the whispers? You have to make an honest woman of me. I will not be your charity. Caleb, I will not be a debt you feel you have to pay." He stood, too, a tower of frustration. "This has nothing to do with honor. This has nothing to do with the town." "Then what is it?" she cried, her hands clenched. "A man like you, a man with land, a good name." "You could have anyone. You could have Mrs. Johansson's sister, or the Soper girl. You don't need me. You don't need a half-breed washerwoman with a burned past and a book of Spanish poetry." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You know I'm no one's dream." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the snow, deeper than the wind. Caleb crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He took her by the shoulders, his grip hard, not to hurt, but to hold, to anchor her. "You're wrong," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "I looked out a window, and I saw a family, and I made a wish. I wished for her. I didn't know who she was. I just knew I was empty. I was a ghost. I was dead. Mira, 2 years, dead." He shook her gently. "Then I found you in the livery, half frozen, and you lit my heart, and you made me laugh, and you made me feel." He leaned in, his forehead touching hers. "You are not no one's dream." His voice broke, thick with the truth. "You're mine." She looked up at him, the tears she'd refused to shed in the church now tracking hot down her face. He didn't offer marriage for honor. He offered it for love. She stayed. The town, as she had predicted, turned its back. It was not a violent shunning, but a cold, hard freeze. Silas Gable at the inn found a new supplier for his beef, a rancher from the next county, Mrs. Soper at the mercantile was suddenly always out of the brand of coffee Caleb preferred, Mrs. Dunn and her circle ensured that the few jobs he might have taken, hauling wood, clearing snow, went to other men. They were isolated on their mountain, 2 pariahs living in sin, but the bunkhouse, as Caleb had promised, was solid. They spent the days leading up to Christmas not in town, but in that small, empty building. They shoveled the drifts from the doorway. They patched the roof. They scrubbed the floors and washed the windows. With every stroke of the brush, Mira felt she was washing away her old life. She was building. The cold was relentless. 2 days after their return, a fresh storm buried the valley, a blizzard that seemed intent on erasing the world. On the second night, a frantic pounding came at the cabin door. It was Leo. He was covered in snow, his chest heaving, his face pale with fright. "It's Mrs. Johansson," he gasped, stumbling inside. "No, not her. The new hand. The one her husband hired. His wife. She's having the baby, and the midwife is stuck in the lower valley. Doc Irwin tried to make it, but his horse lamed. They're alone, and she's screaming." Caleb was already pulling on his heavy coat. Mira ran to her small satchel and grabbed her mother's journal and a small cloth pouch of dried herbs. "I'm coming," she said. "You can't," Caleb said, turning. "It's 10 below, and the wind is a blade." "I'm coming," she repeated, her eyes meeting him. "My mother was a healer. She taught me." The ride was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath. But Caleb knew the land, and he led them, Viento and the roan plunging through drifts as high as their chests. They found the cabin, a small sod structure on the Johansson's back 40, by the single, terrified light in the window. Inside, it was chaos. A young man, barely 20, was weeping in the corner. His wife, a girl Mira's age, was on the bed, her face slick with sweat, her screams thin and animal. The baby was breaching. Mira took one look, and the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear calm. She took off her frozen coat. "Boil water," she commanded the husband. "All the blankets you have, and towels, now." She turned to the girl. "My name is Mira. I am here to help you. You are not alone." For 6 hours, she worked. She used the knowledge from her mother's journal, the instincts her mother had passed down. She was firm, she was gentle, she was calm. She spoke in a low, steady voice, sometimes in English, sometimes in the soft, musical Spanish her mother had used to soothe her. Caleb stayed, out of the way, keeping the fire roaring, handing her the hot water, watching her with a sense of awe. This was not the frightened woman from the livery. This was a force of nature. At dawn, with the storm finally breaking, Mira turned the baby. An hour later, a healthy, screaming cry filled the small cabin. When Mr. Johansson, the main rancher, finally broke through, he found Mira, exhausted, rocking the new baby, the mother asleep, and the new father weeping with gratitude. Johansson, the man whose window Caleb had looked through, took off his hat. He looked at Mira Thorne, not as a harlot, but as a miracle. The story of the blizzard birth thawed the town faster than a spring chinook, but it was the fever that cemented her. A week later, little Thomas, the club-footed boy, fell ill. A deep, barking cough that settled in his lungs. Doc Irwin came, listened to his chest, and shook his head. He gave the mother laudanum for the pain and told her to pray. The boy's mother, desperate, her face raw from weeping, came to the bunkhouse where Mira was now organizing her books. "Miss Mira," she pleaded, "he's burning up. He can't breathe. The doctor, he said it's in God's hands." Mira went. She found the boy in a small back room, his breaths shallow, a blue tinge to his lips. It was the lung fever. Her mother had fought it and lost, but she had taught Mira what she knew. She sent Caleb to the frozen creek bed to find willow bark. She went into the pines herself, digging through the snow to find the tough, stringy roots of a particular plant. For 2 nights, she sat by that boy's cot. She brewed a bitter, steaming tea, forcing it, spoonful by spoonful, between his cracked lips. She bathed him in cool water. She did not sleep. Caleb sat in the main room, a silent guardian, refusing to leave her alone. On the 3rd morning, Thomas's eyes opened. The fever had broken. He looked at Mira and whispered, "Water." When Mira walked out of that house, the small group of neighbors gathered outside, who had been watching in a silent, prayerful vigil, did not part in judgment. They nodded. One woman, one of Mrs. Dunn's own circle, stepped forward and pressed a warm loaf of bread into Mira's hands. "God bless you, child," the woman said, and did not flinch when Mira's hand touched hers. It was Christmas Eve. The cabin was transformed. Mira had brought the outside in, pine boughs, tied with the same red ribbons she had used for the children's branch, sat on the mantel. The smell of pine and baking apples filled the stone room. They had made it. They were safe. "I have something for you," Caleb said. He was standing by the door, his face shy, his hands large and awkward. He brought in his first gift. It was a brass bell. Not a small sleigh bell, but a heavy, proper school bell, polished until it helped. "For the bunkhouse," he said gruffly. "A school needs a bell." Mira touched it, her eyes filling with tears. "Caleb, it's beautiful." "That's not all," he said. He brought in the second. It was a bookcase, small, no more than 3 feet high. It was carved from pine, and he had sanded it smooth as glass. On the side, in careful, deep-cut letters, he had carved her initials, M.T. "For your journal," he said, not meeting her eyes. "And your mother's. A woman's book should have a proper place." She didn't speak. She flew at him, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in his coat, which smelled of snow and pine. He held her, his arms closing around her, solid and sure. That night, they made love. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of the storm. It was not the sacred, healing intimacy of their second night. This was something new. It was a confirmation. It was a celebration. They laid the blankets by the hearth, the firelight painting their bodies in gold and shadow. It was slow, and it was aching. It was the touch of two people who had fought the world and won, who finally believed they deserved this joy. Every kiss was a promise. Every touch was a prayer. They moved together with the slow, deep rhythm of the snow falling outside. Two broken souls made whole, one in the other's arms. Later, as they lay tangled in the blankets, a sound from outside broke the peace. A shout, slurred and angry. A pounding at the door. "I know you're in there. Right, I know she's with you." Mira sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, her heart stopping. She knew that voice. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his trousers, his face a mask of black thunder. "Who is it?" "A man from the missionary school," she whispered, her blood turning to ice. "Jed, a mule skinner. He was one of the ones who—" The door rattled on its hinges. "Open up, you, or I'll kick it in. I know you're in there, you thieving harlot." Caleb grabbed his skinning knife from the mantel. "Stay here," he said. He wrenched the door open. A man, tall and lanky, reeking of whiskey and soaked snow, stumbled in. He had a mean, pinched face and small, dark eyes. He saw Mira by the fire, her dark hair loose, her body wrapped in a blanket. He pointed a shaking finger. "There she is, the thief! Just like I said, that's the one. Stole $200 in silver from the Reverend's desk, burned the school to cover her tracks." Caleb didn't speak. He didn't ask a question. He moved. He hit Jed with a right hand that lifted the man off his feet and sent him sprawling back out onto the porch. Before Jed could get his breath, Caleb was on him. This was not a fight. It was an execution. Caleb's rage, the silent, buried rage of 2 years of grief, had finally found a target. He straddled the man, his hands closing around Jed's throat, smashing his head against the frozen porch boards. "Caleb!" Mira screamed, scrambling, pulling on his shirt. "Anything! Caleb, stop! You'll kill him!" He was deaf. He was lost in a red, murderous haze. Mira saw his face in the firelight. This was the man who had lost his family. He was going to make this man pay for all of it. She scrambled past them, out into the snow, and turned to face them. She saw a small group of people, Hames from the livery, Mr. Johansson and his wife, even Leo, coming up the path, drawn by the Christmas Eve light, carrying small gifts. They had stopped, frozen, watching the spectacle. Mira knew. In that instant, she had to stop it, not just for Caleb, for herself. She grabbed a handful of Jed's hair, yanking his head up from the snow. Caleb's hands were still at his throat, but the motion made him pause. "Look at me, Jed," she commanded, her voice ringing out in the cold. Clear night, sharp as ice. He gurgled, his eyes wild. She stood, releasing him, and turned to the small, stunned crowd. "You think I am the ruin?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "You think I am the fire? Look at what you do to women like me. You hunt us, you use us, you lie about us, and when we find one small patch of warmth, one small place of safety, you come to burn it down." Her voice had done what her hands could not. It had broken through Caleb's rage. He released his grip, his chest heaving. Jed sputtered, coughing, crawling backward like a crab. Caleb stood. He looked at the man he had almost killed. He looked at the witnesses. He looked at Mira, standing there, barefoot in the snow, her head high, the firelight catching the tears on her face. She was magnificent. He walked to her, in front of them all. He took her hand. He didn't just hold it. He lifted it, their grip a defiant chain. He turned his gaze on the pathetic, gasping man on the ground. "This is my woman," Caleb said. His voice was dead calm, more final than any shout. more terrifying than any rage. "Say another word, and I will bury you in the snow." The sun that rose over the jagged peaks of the Montana highlands on the morning of December 25th was not the pale, sickly yellow of the storm days. It was a brilliant, shattering gold. It struck the vast expanse of unbroken snow and fractured into a million diamonds, turning the world into a blinding cathedral of light. Inside the stone cabin, the light found its way through the frosted panes, stretching across the rough-hewn floorboards to the bedroll near the hearth. Mira Thorne woke slowly. For a moment, in the haze of sleep, she braced herself for the cold, for the smell of lye soap, for the lonely, biting wind of the livery attic. Then she felt the arm draped heavy and protective over her waist. She smelled pine resin, wood smoke, and the deep, earthy scent of the man beside her. She turned her head. Caleb was still asleep. His face relaxed in a way she had never seen, the deep furrows between his brows, carved by 2 years of staring into the abyss, had smoothed out. He looked younger. He looked like a man who had finally set down a heavy load. She lay there for a long time, just breathing. The events of the night before, the drunkard Jed, the violence, her intervention, Caleb's public claim, felt like a fever dream. But the ring of bruises on Jed's neck had been real, and Caleb's hand holding hers in front of the town had been real. She shifted, and Caleb's eyes opened. They were clear, blue as the winter sky, and instantly present. He didn't startle. He simply tightened his arm around her, pulling her flush against his chest. "Merry Christmas," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Merry Christmas," she whispered back. It was the first time she had said those words in 4 years without a bitter taste in her mouth. They rose not with the frantic haste of survival, but with the slow, deliberate movements of a household. Caleb built up the fire until the stones of the hearth radiated a solid heat. Mira moved to the small stove. She had saved the last of the dried apples and a tin of precious sugar. She made a batter, her hands moving rhythmically, mixing it with the flour and the last of the lard. The smell of baking apple bread began to fill the cabin, a sweet, warm promise that battled back the scent of the cold stone. Caleb sliced the smoked ham he had been curing in the smokehouse since November. He made the coffee, strong and black, the way he liked it, though he added a spoonful of sugar to hers without asking. They were just sitting down at the table, the steam rising from their cups, when a sound broke the mountain silence. It was a knock. Not the heavy, violent pounding of Jed the night before. This was a small, tentative sound, a rapid tapping, low on the wood. Mira froze, her hand going to her throat. The town. Had they come for retribution? Had the sheriff come to arrest Caleb for the assault? Caleb stood, his face darkening. He moved to the door, his body placing itself instinctively between the wood and Mira. He lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled the door open. Bracing himself for a fight, he stopped. He looked down. Mira, watching from the table, saw his shoulders drop. The tension drained out of his back so fast it was as if someone had cut a string. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Well," Caleb said, his voice thick, "I didn't expect a company this high up." Mira walked to the door and gasped. Standing on the porch, snow up to their knees, were 4 children. Leo stood in the front, his nose bright red from the cold, clutching a burlap sack. Beside him was Thomas, the boy Mira had nursed through the fever, leaning on a crutch but grinning. Behind them were the 2 Miller girls, their faces wrapped in woolen scarves until only their eyes showed. They looked like small, colorful birds against the white landscape. "Miss Mira," Leo chirped, shivering. "We beat the sun. Uncle said we couldn't come, but we snuck out before he woke up." "Leo," Mira breathed, dropping to her knees on the cold floorboards, heedless of the draft. "You walked all this way? In this snow?" Thomas was slow, Leo said, jerking a thumb at his friend. "But we pulled him on the sled part of the way." Thomas stepped forward, shyly. He held out a piece of paper. It was folded into a complex, geometric star. "For the tree," he said, "since you didn't have a real one in town." Mira took the paper star. Her hands were trembling. She looked at the Miller girls, who were holding out a small tin. "Mama made peppermint bark," the older girl whispered. She said to tell you it's for the fever, for helping Thomas." They didn't come in. They were shy of the big, silent man standing behind Mira, and they knew they had to get back before their absence was noted. They thrust their gifts forward, a drawing of a horse that looked vaguely like Viento, a handful of rock candy wrapped in brown paper, the paper star, the tin of sweets. "Merry Christmas, Miss Mira!" Leo shouted, turning to run back down the path. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Caleb!" They scattered like quail, running back down the track toward the valley, their laughter ringing out thin and clear in the freezing air. Mira stayed on her knees, clutching the small, humble treasures to her chest. Paper, sugar, a child's drawing. They were worth more than gold. They were an apology. They were a welcome. They were proof that she had not just passed through this world like a ghost. She had touched it, and it had touched her back. Caleb reached down and pulled her up. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her into his chest and held her while she wept, hot, happy tears soaking into his shirt. The feast that followed was the finest meal Mira had ever eaten. The apple bread was dense and sweet. The apples rehydrated and tart. The smoked meat was salty and rich. They ate with their fingers, wiping the crumbs from their lips, sharing the tin of peppermint bark the Miller girls had brought. Laughter, which had been a stranger to this cabin for 2 years, now seemed to live in the rafters. Caleb told a story about a cow that had managed to get itself stuck on the roof of the old barn during a deep drift winter, mimicking the baffled expression of the animal until Mira was laughing so hard she had to hold her side. She told him about her time in a traveling show in St. Louis, where she had briefly been hired to sew costumes, describing the velvet and the sequins and the smell of the elephants. They talked, not about the past, not about the pain, but about the small, ridiculous things that make up a life. They were building a new history, right there at the rough table, one laugh at a time. As the afternoon wore on, the bright sun began to fade, replaced by a soft, pearlescent gray. The sky lowered, heavy and close, large. Lazy flakes of snow began to drift down, spinning slowly in the windless air. It was a gentle snow, a blanket being pulled up over a sleeping world. Caleb stood and went to the peg by the door where his heavy coat hung. He put it on, then grabbed hers. "Come with me," he said. "It's snowing again," Mira said, though she was already reaching for her boots. "It's soft," he said. "It won't bite." He led her out onto the porch. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of new snow and pine. He took her hand, his glove rough against her mitten, and led her not toward the barn, but around the side of the cabin, toward a small grove of blue spruce that grew sheltered against the rock face. He stopped before a perfect 6-foot pine. Mira stopped, her breath catching in her throat. He had decorated it. It wasn't draped in glass bulbs or tinsel like the trees in the rich houses in St. Louis. It was decorated with the labor of his hands. Dozens of small, wooden stars, whittled from pale aspen wood, hung from the branches on twine. They spun slowly in the gentle air. There were dried berries strung in garlands, and placed carefully on the sturdy boughs were small candles in tin holders, unlit but waiting. "I did it yesterday," he said, his voice gruff, sounding almost embarrassed. "While you were sleeping after the trouble." "Caleb," she whispered. "It's magnificent." He stepped closer to the tree. He took a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel, and began to light the candles, one by one. Small spheres of warm, golden light sprang to life against the gathering dusk and the falling snow. The tree glowed. It pushed back the gray. It pushed back the cold. When the last candle was lit, he turned to her. The golden light reflected in his eyes, softening the hard angles of his face. He looked nervous. This man, who had faced down a lynch mob in a blizzard, looked terrified. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of blue calico, a scrap left over from the doll's dress he had touched with such reverence days before. He unwrapped it. It was a ring. It was old, fashioned from rose gold, worn smooth by years of wear. It had a small, simple engraving of a vine of ivy wrapping around the band. He didn't make a speech. He didn't recite a poem. He simply went down on one knee in the snow. "Mira," he said. His voice was steady now, grounded. "This was my mother's. She wore it for 40 years working this land. It's not new, it's not fancy, but it's strong. It endures." He looked up at her, the snow dusting his dark hair. "I'm asking you to take it. I'm asking you to take my name. Not to save you, not to save me, but because I cannot imagine waking up another morning without you in it." Mira looked at the ring. She looked at the man kneeling in the snow, offering her the only legacy he had left. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the road she had traveled, the burned schoolhouse, the jeering crowds, the cold, lonely nights in stables and attics. She thought of the hunger that had been her constant companion, the hunger for food. Yes, but mostly the hunger for a place where she did not have to keep her boots on, ready to run. She dropped to her knees in the snow, facing him. She didn't take the ring immediately. She reached out and took his face in her hands, feeling the warmth of his skin against the cold air. "I don't need a ring, Caleb," she whispered, her voice fierce and quiet. "I don't need gold. I don't need a name to hide behind." She searched his eyes. "I need a place. I need a place in this world where I am not a stranger, where I am not a trespasser." Caleb covered her hands with his own. He leaned his forehead against hers. "Then let me be at your place," he replied. "Let this land be your place. Let my arms be the walls, and my heart be the hearth. You will never be a stranger here." The tears finally spilled over, hot tracks on her cold cheeks. "Yes," she sobbed, a laugh bubbling up through the tears. "Yes, I will take your place, and I will give you mine." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her hand. He pulled her to her feet, and then he kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of snowflakes and wood smoke, of peppermint and promise. It was deep and slow, a seal set upon a covenant. Above them, the clouds broke for just a moment, revealing a patch of velvet night sky studded with stars, bright and cold and indifferent. But down here, in the circle of the candlelight from the tree, there was only warmth. The firelight from the cabin window glowed orange behind them, casting long shadows across the snow. Caleb pulled back just an inch, looking down at her. His thumb brushed the snowflakes from her long, dark lashes. He smiled, a true, full smile that reached his eyes. "All I want for Christmas," he whispered again, the words echoing the wish he had cast into the empty wind weeks ago, "is you." Mira smiled back, her hand gripping the lapel of his coat, twisting the ring on her finger. "You have me," she said. Whole. Epilogue. The years that followed were not easy, for the high country does not bargain with ease. There were winters that killed the cattle and summers that scorched the grass. There were fevers and floods, and the slow, hard work of turning a rough land into a home. But the schoolhouse bell rang every morning across the valley, a clear, brassy sound that called the children of miners, ranchers, and outcasts alike. And every evening, smoke rose from the chimney of the stone cabin, where the hearth was never cold. Mira kept her journal. She filled it with the names of the children she taught, the herbs she gathered, and the days she lived. On the last page of the leather-bound book, dated 40 years after that blizzard Christmas, her handwriting was shaky, but the ink was dark and sure. December 25th, 1923. They called me ruined when I came here. They said I was a woman made of ash and sin. I thought so too. I thought the cold would take me, or the loneliness would eat me alive. But I was wrong. The cold did not break me. It forged me. I looked for a shelter, and I found a kingdom. I looked for a savior, and I found a partner. I look at him now, sleeping in the chair by the fire, his hair white as the snow on the ridge, his hand still strong enough to hold mine. I thought I was ruined. But this land, this man, He loved me whole, and in the wild cold, I found warmth. Closing message. Thank you so much for journeying with Caleb and Mira through the snow, the heartbreak, and the healing of the Montana high country. It has been a privilege to share this Wild West love story with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of romance, grit, and survival on the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. And finally, I invite you to share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did Mira and Caleb's story warm your heart? What was your favorite moment? I read every comment and cherish your connection to these stories. Until next time, keep your hearth fires burning.